All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to June's Lunch and Learn. We are here with Ben McFarlane, who's going to be giving us a presentation on the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission's brilliant regional resilient guidelines that they've been working on for the past couple of years and have finally published. More people are joining in. Feel free to drop your name and your organization in the chat. So that I can take notes on who's attending. And then I will allow Ben to share screen and we can take it away, Ben.
All right, well, thanks, Ian. And thanks to Wetlands Watch for inviting me to be a part of this today. I know several of you in the chat, but some new faces, so pretty small group. But if you have questions throughout, please, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but or just like cut in. We can make this fairly casual today. But let me go ahead and full screen. And Ian, can you see everything look good on your end?
Yes, full screen, everything looks perfect.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Ben McFarlane. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. For those of you that aren't familiar with our region or with planning district commissions, we are one of 21 PDCs throughout the Commonwealth. Our region covers 17 jurisdictions, including 10 cities, 6 counties, and 1 town, with a population between 1.7 and 1.8 million folks here in southeastern Virginia. Our board is comprised of local elected and appointed officials, and they meet regularly to discuss issues of regional concern. At the staff level, I work in our water resources department. We provide a number of services to our communities, including technical assistance, development of policy recommendations, and also lead a number of committees that address different topics. And so the work that I'm talking about today falls under our resilience program here at the PDC. We have our board, as I mentioned before, who kind of oversees our overall budget and work program. We have a somewhat on hiatus resilience subcommittee of that board that helps to kind of really focus in on some of these issues from an elected official standpoint. We also have our committee, our Coastal Resiliency Committee, which has representatives from each of our member jurisdictions to really provide some of that in-depth feedback on the work that we're doing and help really to guide our program at a day-to-day and nuts and bolts level. And then we have staff. We have a staff of 3 in our resiliency program that are also part of our larger water resource department here that work on the technical products that I'm going to be talking about today. So in terms of what we do, we have policy work that we develop. We research policy recommendations, look at good ideas from other places, try to address the concerns that our local governments have for different issues related to resilience and water resources, and then kind of come up with recommendations that we think are well suited for our region here in Hampton Roads. We do a lot of coordination. We host meetings, we plan, we provide that forum for our communities to work with each other, and also to work with non-governmental partners and also other governmental partners at the state and federal levels. We have a number of outreach efforts. So you may be, and I hope many of you are familiar with our regional flood insurance education program, getfloodfluent.org, which we are in the midst of refreshing right now, but also using that as a springboard to talk about some of the issues with the general public that I'm talking about today. And then we have a number of efforts where we do implementation of projects, whether that's technical work like building tools, and completing analyses and having those assets available to our communities. But also we have, for example, a program where we've installed some flood sensors throughout the region, and we're working on that as well to expand that work. So a lot of work that gets done through our resilience program, but all of it designed to help make the work that our localities are doing more effective and more resilient. So today I'm talking about our design standards work. So over the last several years, we've been working with our community, with our committee, with each of our member communities on talking about the need to update our design standards to account for changing climate. So when we talk about design standards, we're talking about things like the precipitation design storms that are used to implement stormwater or erosion and sediment control or floodplain management requirements at the local level. those design standards are really, they are one part of the suite of tools that are available to localities, to governments, and to individuals really to help buy down risk. When we talk about, dealing with water, with the built environment, uh, we don't really want water to be in a lot of the places that it goes, and so we try to find ways to control it. We try to find ways to mitigate the impacts of that water when it does, occur in areas where it's not desired. And we put projects in place. We build stormwater infrastructure. Um, we buy flood insurance. We use different materials for a building. So all these different actions that our localities can take at the project, the policy level, they're all different tools that are used to buy down that risk to the point where it's a manageable residual amount that people can tolerate, so that when something does happen, they've managed it as much as that's possible, or as financially desirable. And then whatever that residual risk is left, that's the amount that we're able to handle. But design standards are a key way that we can help to buy down that risk from the design start phase of a building project. So why do we need new standards? Well, that's a great question. Our communities already have in place many design standards for the programs that I mentioned before. So every day when people are developing plans, they're doing the engineering and design work to adopt or to actually create a project, to take it from the proposal to the design to the construction to the ongoing use of a project. They are using these standards that our localities and our states have set up to make those decisions, to inform the decisions about what a project should look like. But unfortunately, a lot of those standards, most of them, in fact, are based on historic observations that are now out of date. Atlas 14, for example, that's the precipitation atlas that's referenced in state code, in the state administrative laws. The data set used to create that product extended only to the year 2000, for example. Many of our other standards that reflect for tailwater conditions, which I'm going to get into here in a few minutes, those are based on a standard that just says mean sea level or mean high water. Well, the current National Tidal Datum Epic that tells us what those elevations are ended in 2001, for example. So all these standards, we're looking to the past to tell us what the standards should be. Well, unfortunately, that assumption that the past that the present and that the future will look like the past is no longer really valid. And so when we're talking about trying to build our communities to be resilient, not just for today, but for the future, it's important for us to take that into account when we actually create and we adopt the design standards that we're using for the actual design and construction of these projects. And so what we have been working on for a number of years now are the development or these design guidelines at the regional level that our communities will have the opportunity to adopt individually as part of their own ordinances or local policies, to the extent that they feel that it's important enough, and also that it's feasible enough for them to do at the local level. So I just want to reiterate, for those of you who aren't familiar with planning district commissions, we're not a legislative body. We don't actually mandate policy changes. Our job is to advise and to provide an opportunity for our localities to discuss this work. And so certainly they have weighed in on these products, but at the end of the day, they're all recommendations for our localities to adopt. They're not requirements. One of the things, in addition, that we try to take into account with these design guidelines is that we don't want and certainly don't think that a one-size-fits-all approach is applicable here. What we want to do is to be able to provide a nuanced approach to design, so that different types of projects are designed for the needs of those projects. If a project has a longer lifespan, that might require a higher standard to make sure that it's usable for that entire lifespan, compared to something that has a shorter lifespan. And similarly, for projects that are more critical, a higher standard might be more appropriate in those cases as well. And then also what we've done with our work is to focus on both the projections for what we think our climate is going to look like in the future, and then specific applications for how those projections would be incorporated into those design standards. So a few things we want to do, and I'm, just kind of build on what I was just saying here. One is that these are all based on the best available science. What we have tried to do with these guidelines and recommendations is to go and find the best available work that's already out there. We're not trying to replicate work, but we're a planning agency. We're not a university. We're not researchers, so we're not going to be developing this work on our own. We're going and we're trying to find the best work that's already out there that we can use for the work that goes into these design guidelines. I mentioned before that different standards for different types of projects, we really want these to be appropriate for the use cases that they're going to be applied to. That we don't want to have a project or a standard that exceeds the cost of doing a specific project, that really just makes it way out of whack. And similarly, we want these to be implementable. We want these guidelines, at the end of the day, if a locality, can't actually use these in practice, then that kind of defeats the purpose. And so what we've tried to do with these guidelines is to make them usable and easily kind of adoptable by a locality if they choose to incorporate them into their own policies. And so in terms of what we actually have in our design guidelines, broken them up into three kind of categories of information that we're providing for our localities. One is observations. We've gone and collected the data on sea level and rainfall just to provide us with a foundation for what we have already seen in the past and what the trend lines currently look like. And then we've combined those with projections based on climate science to look at what we think sea level is going to look like, on into the future, and also similarly for rainfall as well. And then building on those projections and observations, specific applications for tailwater elevations, rainfall design storms, and then joint storm pairs. And so right now our focus is on stormwater management, but we also have a number of other things that are underway that are all related to this that are more focused on floodplain management. But for now, the guidelines really are focused on that stormwater management aspect. And so our document that we have set up, it's still, we're tweaking it, and I can get into that a little bit more later on. We talk about kind of next steps, but how it's framed, we have an introduction, kind of some advice on how to use it, and then sections on the climate trends and projections, applications and recommendations for specific policies for our localities to adopt. And then at the end, we have some technical work on the methodologies and various reference tables that localities can copy and paste into their ordinances or into their public facilities manuals. All right, observations. So we're already seeing changes in our climate. If you look at the sea level trend charts that we have courtesy of NOAA, we're fortunate here in Hampton Roads that we actually have a very robust network of tide gauges that have been in place for decades. The Sewell's Point tide gauge in Norfolk dates back to the late 1920s. So we have nearly a century of records there. The combined record for the gauges, there was a gauge in Gloucester Point. It's since been moved to across the river to Yorktown. That goes back to the early 1950s. At the Bay Bridge Tunnel, there's another one that was established in the 70s. We have others that have been decommissioned so that the records are not consistent or don't kind of bring us into the present. But we have this record, right? We have measurements that show how sea level has changed over time. And for us, this is critical. This provides the foundation for all of the work really that we do when it comes to talking about flooding, to talking about sea level trends and projections. Having this record has been critical for our regional discussions. For those of you that are from Hampton Roads or from coastal Virginia that have been involved in this topic for any length of time, that you probably come across these charts to really show that this is not something that is just based on models. It's based on actual records and observations. And so the overall trend here in our region is roughly 5 millimeters per year. That's the long-term trend. The near-term trend is a little bit higher than that. But what that really corresponds to is about 1.5 feet of sea level rise every century. And so that's the long-term trend that we have that we're then building on with some additional models. Another way of looking at this is to think about how often we actually see flooding. This is a tool, the NOAA's new sea level calculator, and I haven't checked lately. I hope it's still up and running. Um, but this shows this is taken the data that I was just showing you with the sea level trends, the same tide gauge data, and applied that to calculate the number of flood days in Norfolk, Virginia. So we don't have this data set for every single tide gauge. It's limited only to those with a certain record length. But what you can just clearly see by this chart here is that the number of flood days has gone up substantially since that gauge was first put into play. What used to be that we'd only see flooding at a certain threshold for major storm events. Now we're seeing it much more frequently for, smaller events, higher high tide events, king tide days. These are not all days that correspond to hurricanes or other major storms. It might just be a particularly high tide that results in a flooding event. But the key takeaway here is that we are observing more frequent flooding, and that should inform our planning for how we design our infrastructure that we're installing today. Similar story with rainfall, or the data is not quite as available, or as the trend's not quite as clear. But we do see with the rainfall record, and I believe this is from the Norfolk Airport, that if we look at just the long-term trend, that there is an increase, and you can see in that chart here in the upper left of the slide that this is the total record that we have for both colors of blue there, and that orange line is the linear trend for that entire record. And why there's two there, and I kind of clipped out the legend down there at the bottom. The darker blue color there corresponds to the record that's included in Atlas 14. And I'm going to be talking about precipitation atlases here a little bit more in a moment, but that's the record that we're using to actually inform our current design standards for rainfall. The dotted blue line below that shows that's the linear trend just based on that record for that's included in Atlas 14. When we include more recent observations through 2023, there's a small but significant increase in that linear trend. Before it looked, it's not really showing much, but now it's showing a small but discernible increase in rainfall year over year. And so while we have dry years, we have wet years, we can see that using the full record versus the record that's currently in Atlas 14 really gives us a much better idea of what that trend actually is, and that by including that new data, we're seeing more and more rainfall. And then similarly, this is some work from the National Climate Assessment that shows just how much, not just the annual rainfall has increased, but also that we're seeing on those heavy rainfall days more and more rain as well. So it's not only getting more rain, it's getting to be more intense. And factoring that in to our design standards is going to be critical to making sure that we're building for the right kind of storm in the right places. So mentioned before, so we have our observations of what we've already seen for both sea level and for rainfall. But unfortunately, we have also projections that show that, although there has already been observed change, that change is expected to increase or to continue, and also to accelerate over time. We think about sea level trends. This is an analysis from VIMS that shows, this is their sea level report card. It's a wonderful tool that the Center for Coastal Resources Management has put together at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. You can see the observations are there. Those are the blue lines, and then the dots there showing monthly mean sea level through the early 2020s, going back to 1969. And then you can see the green line there that shows the linear trend. The orange line is the quadratic trend. And so this is just an extrapolation of a trend that is observed, that is identified in the observational data set. So this does not have any sort of climate model incorporated into it. This is just crunching the numbers from those observations to discern that there is acceleration occurring, and that we can project out, just based on that trend, what sea level is going to look like through the middle of the 21st century. But if we think about what we talk about including the climate models in there, this is the type of picture we get, right? So here we have that same data that I showed earlier with the annual flood days in Norfolk. So those are the same values in the blue bars at the bottom there that I showed on the earlier slide. And this is what those values might look like in the coming decades when we start to factor in different amounts of sea level rise. So each of those red lines corresponds to one of the NOAA sea level scenarios that was published in 2022. I believe it's 2022. And so we have, even with the low scenario for sea level rise, that there's going to be a substantial increase in the number of flood days in Norfolk. And we can anticipate that that would apply to many of our lower lying communities here in Hampton Roads. So Hampton, Pocosa, York County, Virginia Beach, Portsmouth, parts of Chesapeake, parts of Suffolk, Gloucester County, and also for most of coastal Virginia, where you have these low-lying areas where the geology, the topography have created a situation where a small but significant amount of sea level rise can increase substantially the number of flood days. This is this tool here. This is from MRISA. It's the Mid-Atlantic Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program. It's part of NOAA. They worked with the RAND program, or RAND, and also the Chesapeake Bay program to develop a future IDF curve tool for the Chesapeake Bay watershed and all of Virginia, just showing what the projected, if we take into account climate scenarios, with just looking at the rainfall data and apply what those projected climate conditions are going to be like, we can show that there's going to be an increase in the amount of rainfall that we expect. And this is just showing the difference for one of those return periods. This is the 2-year return for RCP 4.5. That's one of the climate scenarios for the period from 2020 to 2070. And you can see, it's a small, it doesn't look like a lot. It's less than an inch. It's not a lot of rainfall, but it's a significant amount. And it certainly, it adds up over time, and a little bit of rainfall in a wide area can mean, a little bit of depth can actually mean a significant quantity when it comes to the volume of rainfall that we need to deal with at a site level, but also across an entire community. So we have our observations, our projections, and then, if we look at those together, we can think of ways to actually amend our design standards so that we can reduce not only our current risk, but also account for what that future risk is going to look like. And so this here is the example. These are our regional sea level scenarios, sea level rise scenarios. Our commission adopted these, a recommendation for these back in 2018 originally, and we recently reviewed them again and didn't feel the need to update them because the NOAA sea level rise scenarios still support, I think, the use of these three at our regional level here in Hampton Roads. So based on the observations and then the near term and the long term projections, our recommendation to our localities is to continue to use 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050, 3 feet of sea level rise between 2050 and 2080, and 4.5 feet of sea level rise between 2080 and 2100. These all the start year for this is 1992, because that's the year that we use for our tidal datums here in it's nationwide, but so these are already on the books in terms of what our region has approved of, and several of our localities already use these for their local planning and policies. But we're able to, with this design guidelines effort, to take those sea level rise scenarios and apply them to some specific applications for stormwater management. And one of those tools is the development of recommended tailwater elevations for communities to use when doing stormwater management calculations. So when you're doing a project, you're doing the stormwater engineering, and it's a tidally influenced area, that project drains to a tidal body of water, accounting for what the water surface level is going to be in that pipe, in that outfall, is critical to making sure that you have enough volume to manage the amount of water that will be coming off of that site. So some of that water, you can manage it on site. You can try to infiltrate it on site with different BMPs. But a lot of times you're trying to convey some of that water away, oftentimes through pipes or through other hardened infrastructure. If you don't account for what sea level is actually going to look like, not just now, but into the future, you will not have the appropriate volume in that system to manage the rainfall that you're seeing, and so you end up getting flooding on site. And so we try to avoid that. Generally, having water on a site is considered a bad thing. And so what we've done here is take those sea level scenarios and apply them to the different return periods we have for various storm return periods. So the 1 year all the way to the 500 year, and then combine those with our 1.5 and 3 feet sea level rise scenarios to produce different tailwater elevations for each HUC 12 watershed that's tidally influenced in Hampton Roads. And then we put them all on a table you can see here for each of our communities, so that they would have a reference they can go and use to require for different stormwater calculations. So one reason, might be wondering why we didn't include the 4.5 feet of sea level rise scenario here was that was generally considered to be by our communities to be too far out for the design and planning and construction of stormwater management infrastructure. So for now, we have just the kind of the current day, the 1.5 and the 3 feet of sea level rise, those three scenarios in there. But for all those different return periods and different types of decisions might reference a different return period. So you might have the 1 year requirement for some things, the 10 year for others, or the 2 or the 5. And then, for those larger return periods of 50 through the 2 to the 500, those will likely be, used for things like floodplain management, but probably not for your typical stormwater management project. We've also put together projections for rainfall design storms, so similar. So we have different return periods. How we calculated these, we used that tool from Marissa. That's another visual from that website there. I showed you the chart earlier, but this is the map tool showing that's just another way to access the same data where it's at the locality level. So instead of being at the watershed level, now we're at the locality level. And what we have done is created or calculated a multiplier based on all the different return periods provided in the Marissa tool that our localities can apply to all of the design storms that they currently have. So right now we all use Atlas 14. In Virginia, we're using Atlas 14 Volume 2. That has value. So every locality, if you go and you type in your location, or if you have a locality, you select this, just values to cover your entire locality. That's the baseline document. And then these multipliers, or whether it's 10, 15, or 20%, depending on the locality, can be used to provide a projection for what the future rainfall might be. And so what we have done with our analysis is looked at the specific kind of we looked at land cover, we looked at development patterns, we looked at what the projections were going to be from that Marissa tool, and then developed a unique multiplier for each, right? So different places have different types of development, different levels of infrastructure that they built to manage stormwater. Really, the key driver is impervious cover. So that combined with the climate projections, which do vary across our region, not so much within a locality, even the largest localities, the range of the climate projections was not substantial, but moving from the north of our region or the northwest of our region to the southeast, we do see a change in what the projections are going to look like, a small but significant change. And so that's why we recommended between a 10% and a 20% increase over Atlas 14, with a minimum of 10%. But then for those communities with more impervious cover, suggested that they go all the way up to a 20% increase of Atlas 14. And then on top of that, what we have also recommended, and this is based on some work that came out of Virginia Beach, is that we should look at, for tidal areas, tidally influenced areas, it's really important to combine both like a design storm that has a combined tidal elevation that incorporates climate and sea level rise, and the same thing with rainfall, that we should have both of these together, and that it is whatever the appropriate design storm is, that it should actually include the right standards for both of those factors when you're in an area where that matters. And so, for example, the 1 year design storm would be the 10-year tidal elevation with the 1 year rainfall event. The 10-year design storm would be the 1 year tidal elevation and the 10-year rainfall event, and so on. You can see here in the chart on the left. I mentioned earlier that we wanted to make sure this was a nuanced approach. Um, when we have what's called, so right now that we have basically the same standard for most projects. Some localities have different standards for larger projects versus smaller projects. Um, Oftentimes there might be a higher standard for critical projects. That's like so currently under the federal floodplain management regulations. I believe that's Executive Order 11988. I think Ian, correct me if I'm wrong on that one. That requires, for critical projects that they have there's a separate consideration for those compared to non-critical projects. Um, but this becomes even more important when we talk about including or incorporating climate change into our design guidelines. Timing really matters. Criticality really matters when conditions are changing on the ground. Our previous standards, our current standards, really they assume what's called stationarity. They assume that conditions are not changing, and so we don't have to really think about how long something is going to be around or how long something needs to be useful in order to justify the expenditure of actually putting that infrastructure in place. Um, and so with this analysis, what we've done, and we went through and surveyed a bunch of other efforts that were similar to this, um, identified just different ranges of lifespan that should be incorporated into the decision-making process. So so up to 30 years, mid between 30 and 60 years, long 60 to 80, and then very long projects would be greater than 80 years. And then also, a recommendation to highlight or identify as class of critical projects that where you might require a higher standard. These things like hospitals, first responders, emergency operations centers, shelters, hazardous materials locations, and anything else that a locality might think is like, okay, this is something that if flooding happens here or we get too much water on this site, really bad things could happen. So let's make sure that we're building higher, that we're building different, that we're building more resilient, so that those critical projects stay online during even the most stressful, most impactful events. All right, so that's what we've done with those are the design guidelines that we have published. They're in draft form on our website right now. Right now we are going through and reviewing them again to make sure that the references that we're using are still available. Some of you may be aware that some of the federal websites and tools that information is being changed and updated, or some of it's being taken down. And so we had a few references in there that need to be removed because they're no longer live. And so that the drafts, all those tables and figures, they are on our website. They're available through the agenda that was published for our commission meeting back in January. But we're also working on efforts to, while we're updating that PDF document, what we're also trying to do is to develop different tools that our localities and others can use to access this information in a more usable format. And so one of the things that we have built here over the years at the HRPDC is what we call HRGeo. It's our Hampton Roads Geospatial Exchange Online. It's our online GIS data portal. We are currently in the process of transitioning to an Esri enterprise structure, and so are going to be substantially improving our online GIS capabilities. Currently, a number of our resilience data sets are already on HRGeo. So if you're interested, we have our regional elevation certificate database. Some of our sea level rise scenarios are also online. But we also want to build tools that will take the data and the recommended values for tailwater, for precipitation from that PDF document and put them into a GIS-based tool that people can use as a reference. And so this is kind of a draft version of what that tool might look like. And so I have a way to kind of select where your area of interest is. So whether it's your locality or your HUC 12, you can also click it on the map and select the different sea level scenario or return period for the rainfall storm you're interested in. You could also click it on the map as well, and that will bring up the value from those tables for each locality, depending, so that will be a way to more interactively work with the data, with the product, so that you can easily find the value that you're looking for your calculations. So kind of to wrap things up, and we can get into discussion and Q&A. We know that these standards are going to be more expensive to implement than the current standards are. We're increasing the size. We're making people build. We're not, but people would be building larger. We'll be build bigger, higher infrastructure. But we also know that higher standards reduce risk from flooding. So either way, there's a cost. We can either pay more in terms of money for projects when we're building them or maintaining them, or we can pay more implicitly in terms of the risk that we are shouldering as individuals, as neighborhoods, as communities, when it comes to the performance of the infrastructure that is serving the public. So where are we heading next in this? I mentioned before early on that the PDC, we don't make people do things. Our job is to provide information to localities, and so at the moment there's no state or federal requirement to adopt these standards. I would anticipate that when and if new data products for like precipitation atlases, or if sea level rise is ever incorporated into the regulatory program for the National Flood Insurance Program, at that point, then yes, there would be some sort of requirement, whether it's state or federal, to adopt standards like the ones that I've been talking about here today. But for now, there is no requirement. So while we've recommended these standards for our localities, where they go with them is up to them. And there are a lot of options available. You could do a policy for public projects for your own infrastructure. There could be a requirement or standards incorporated directly into your local stormwater ordinance, floodplain ordinance, or to a public facilities manual. So for example, Virginia Beach has a public works design standards manual that includes some of these higher standards that they adopted actually before we started working on this regional initiative. And so those are the different kind of ways that a locality can make these more regulatory in nature. But there's also the option to just reference them and to use them as part of the design process to just see kind of what the impacts might be, but also what the potential costs might be of incorporating these recommendations into the design of a project. We also think that other users will be interested from the private, non-public sectors. Throughout this whole process, we've had some very good engagement with our local A&E companies, people that work with localities that participate in our Coastal Resiliency Committee and our working group. And so we've gotten several inquiries from consultants about the status of these when they go and work with their own clients. They want to be able to reference these standards as a way of saying, it might not be the requirement, but it is the recommendation that the region has worked on together. And so if a client is trying to be more conscious of how resilient their project might be, this becomes a reference document that they can use. And then I showed you the stuff from HRGO before. We want to have different ways of getting to this information. We're going to put it on our website. It'll have its own page on our resilience program section, and then also to make it available through hrgo.org. But also we're in the process of designing a resilience hub for all of our resilience tools and data that we're going to be hopefully rolling out later this year, that would kind of fall under HRGO. So a few just kind of other things to tie into this. I've mentioned Atlas 14 a few times throughout this presentation. That's the current precipitation frequency atlas that we all reference here in Virginia. So Virginia, along with several other states, funded the development of a new Atlas 14 volume that will update the data that's in it, right? So the values in that new volume will be different, will probably be higher than than the ones that are in the current volume 2. That update is currently underway, and it's anticipated to be rolled out publicly in final form in the first quarter of 2026. It's been delayed a little bit, but it's that latest progress report indicated that that's the timeline they're working on right now, is so Q1 2026 for that tool. And then also in parallel, started a little bit later, but NOAA has been working on a product called Atlas 15. This is a new precipitation frequency atlas that would be a nationwide product that when it was originally proposed would have a new volume 1, which would be the current flood risk or current rainfall conditions, and then a volume 2, which would incorporate climate projections like what we've talked about today. Recently, volume 2 was kind of put on ice. It's been paused. I'm not sure exactly what the official word for that would be, but right now the focus is on just that volume 1 of updating the current precipitation conditions. Our board, we sent a letter to NOAA saying that we think that volume 2 is still very important and we want to see it continued. In any case, the Atlas 15 is supposed to be rolled out for the continental United States in 2026. So we'll have these new products that will come out that will be able to help inform some of the work that our localities are doing when it comes to stormwater management. The nice thing about that Atlas 14 update is that right now our state administrative code it references Atlas 14. So while changing that to 15 should not be a hard process, I don't know how significant that would be considered. But an update to Atlas 14 would immediately go into effect because that volume 13 will replace volume 2 for Virginia and the other states that were covered by the new product. We're also paying attention to some updates in local flood maps, flood insurance rate maps. So that's going on in the kind of the western tidewater part of our region. So that's Isle of Wight County, Southampton County, Franklin, Suffolk. I think Surrey County has already been completed. And so we anticipate seeing final firms for those communities later this year. And those really will increase the availability of non-regulatory data. So they haven't really, the new firms don't include or they don't change really the regulatory floodplain. So the AE values, that's what they have done though is that they've gone in and modeled other tributaries and streams throughout those communities so that the A zones are going to be much more widespread. So we'll have a much better idea of what the real flood risk is in those communities from a riverine and rainfall perspective. So speaking of rain, the state, the DCR folks are working on, still working on phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and also the Flood Protection Master Plan that include a pluvial flood modeling component. So it's really exciting to see that modeling work, and we're still looking at it to see kind of how useful it might be for our localities. And then at our level here at the PDC, we've been working on a parallel, separate effort to develop guidance for resilient BMPs. So, about 10 years ago, we did some work to identify recommended stormwater best management practices for the coastal plain. We've gone through and worked with AMT engineers to actually update that, to add in some new types of BMPs, but also to think about which ones might be more adaptable or resilient when it comes to more frequent flooding from sea level rise, more intense rain, saltwater intrusion, and other climatic conditions that we might see during the lifespan of some of these BMPs that we're putting in place and projects throughout Hampton Roads. Just kind of a few parting thoughts. One, really, when it comes to doing our jobs as planners, designers, engineers, a changing climate requires condition or design standards that account for that change. We can't assume that the future is going to look like today. And taking that into account is critical to making sure that the infrastructure that is being designed and built is built to the right standard. We've already seen increases in sea level and rainfall. That's going to go up based on both the observational trend and also the different projections that we have available. We are convinced at the PDC that providing better information to decision makers at the policy level, to designers at the, in public and private practice, and also to residents will help make them or enable them to make better decisions. And also that these higher standards will reduce risk. And so we understand that they're going to be more expensive to implement. And certainly that some sites may be, it might be a challenge, right? And figuring out kind of how we do this will come down to site by site considerations. But that at the end of the day, doing this work, implementing standards like these will result in more resilient communities. And so that's it, all I have for today. Thank you so very much for being here this afternoon, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you all may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. I know that we had one question midway through about access to slides. Will these be online at HRPDC.va.gov, or would I be able to get a copy and send these out?
I am happy to send you a slide deck, Ian, that you can send out or post to your website for this.
Fantastic. I know that HRPDC is developing a new parking lot with impervious cover. Were these resilient standards applied to that project?
No, they weren't. But I'm fairly certain. I think Jill is actually from our staff is on the line. But no, our parking lot was designed to to comply with the current standards. But I mean it's performing very, very well and probably above what is necessary to meet the minimums. But I think Jill would probably be the better person to answer that question. We have, and for those of you that haven't been to our building, we have a parking lot that or really it's a stormwater BMP that provides parking in a lot of ways that we were able to build our main parking lot with help from the Department of Environmental Quality, a grant, and for Chesapeake Bay program priorities. And so it's got a number of different features. The idea behind this parking lot, the project, was to really test out and try different things. And so there's infiltration basins, there's permeable pavement in some areas. We have devices that capture sediment before it goes into that permeable pavement. And so a lot of really interesting practices that we put in. And yeah, it's really cool. So especially obviously when it's raining, that looks dreary. It's not pleasant to be out in the rain. But when we've got some major storms here over the last few months, we'll go outside and watch it and just see everything at work. And it's incredible to see how these practices, when they're actually implemented, that they do function as intended. That's the question from Kevin. So we have just a few kind of minor tweaks to make to that resilience report, and I'm hopeful that I'll be able to tackle that today, actually, but certainly next week, and then to get that onto our website as soon as possible. But it's I would say it's 99.5% done.
Now, this has been a labor of love for you. What sort of journey
That might
when
be
you were
that's a little strong, Ian.
looking at
Relationship.
looking at previous presentation slides from like 2023, it looks like some of the data sources changed throughout. Did you find, using, for example, like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, was it
Yeah, so I think
NACS? That's it.
yeah, so you mentioned some of the data sources. So we looked for the best available data we could find. So we looked through all the different flood insurance studies. So if so FEMA produces flood insurance studies, which are then used to create the flood insurance rate maps. But the flood insurance studies actually have a lot more in them that localities can use. And so certainly that was a big part of the tailwater elevations work. But then also for the, one of the, if we're getting into the weeds here a little bit, the North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study was done by the Corps of Engineers after Hurricane Sandy, and they included an analysis that where they ran all their storm surge analysis, and then they added in a meter of sea level rise to see how that would change what those water surface elevations would be, and they found that at lower increments of sea level rise, that it's fairly linear. But once you get beyond 3 feet or so, that it actually, you get more than just that amount of sea level rise in terms of the impact on a storm surge. And so we did account for that non-linearity in the tailwater elevations. But that's something that we're also going to be looking at reviewing. My understanding is that the Corps is actually updating the grid, the mesh grid for the NACS tool. And so we might actually have a much higher resolution analysis. We can go into the weeds, and if anybody's really curious about that, it's in the documentation for these tools. So there's an appendix that it would have all that nitty-gritty information.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
We do try to provide, for staff, for localities, and for others, when we do these products, really to provide kind of the step-by-step process for how the recommendations, how these values were calculated. And so that anybody can go in and replicate the work, but also that we provide that information so that they will know what we did and what we didn't do, and if there's anything that else needs to be accounted for.
Nice. Do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any others. So I might say we can call it. Thank you so much for your time, Ben. This is insightful. I will send an email out with the slides when I get them, as well as when this recording gets put online, whenever that is. And for people who are interested in future lunch and learns, we are waiting for the completion of the Community Flood Preparedness Fund acceptance to be officially announced. It looks like, according to what I saw online, the External Advisory Committee, DCR recommended HRPDC's one studies project to be approved. And so fingers crossed for the regional floodway sensors that goes through. We are, of course, waiting for official confirmation from Secretary Tallon. I believe is the last person that needs to get that before they are announced. And so that should be any week now. And we will then go and review what got accepted and where those projects are when that is announced. So to be determined. Awesome.